We're about to start the session. I will be the only one. So welcome to DIME session. So you're there, you're listening. So you need to be there. You will look at the to come and we will discuss about how the features of working for this meeting. So I will not go through the notebook, but we will go to the meeting. And about the agenda, so we will go to the agenda sheet, but we have some technologies. Thank you. I see that there is someone on Java. Okay, so you will be able to, I think you can see you're on Java? Okay. She's there. Okay. Okay. And so we do rapidly through the document sections for the working group, and we have two presentations tonight on the different sets. And I would like to keep maybe more than 5 minutes to discuss what should be the future of the work. This mic? It's yeah. Hello, once you are listening to
you would say Melissa, you would want to stop.
Hello, Janet. Can you hear me?
One, two. Okay, I will try with this one. I think it will be better. So, Martin, please.
Yeah, Martin Dolly. Okay, so with respect to diameter security, when would that be discussed? Up in the beginning or at the end of wrap up?
On the diameter security, we will discuss this point at the end of the session.
Okay.
At least I have some points on the. I think it's better. I think the mic was not on. So let's go quickly through the status for the working group documents or non-working group documents. So basically, we have 2 documents that are blocked in the editor queue, mainly due to the Shepherd laziness myself. So I need to review one of them, and this one is so both of the documents are linked to the third one, and this one needs a review and to go through the AG. And so there is no issue with this one. It's just because one document is missing, so it's a misref for the load information and agent overload. Both are linked to the rate control algorithm. So this will be done right after this meeting. Steve, please.
Steve Donovan, a little nit. You've got the editors wrong on the list.
Excuse me?
The editors on the list is not correct. I'm the editor on load information, and I'm not the editor on 4006 BIS.
Okay.
Just a nit.
Okay, thank you. After that, we have 3 working documents for which the status is quite, I would say, unclear. So we have first the diameter group signaling. You would like to say something for the IEG review? Okay. So the first one will be the diameter group signaling that is in the working group for a while now. We have received a new version of the document, and from the author's point of view, it's quite stable, but only from the author's point of view. We need more review. We were expecting additional reviews, but it was not the case. So the next step normally should be working group last call and last call, but maybe Marco, you would like to say something on that?
Well, not much to say. As you said, before last IETF 98, we published 2 new updates covering all the comments that have been made before it. So some of them have been checked on a peer-to-peer basis. Some have been discussed and confirmed on the mailing list. So I think the document is ready for a detailed technical expert review, and we're fine and happy with updating again, but we need comments to progress the document.
I think that from a technical point of view, we received one good review from Steve, but not so much except this one. Okay, so we will see what to do, but from a working group point of view, I could ask for working group last call, but I just need to ensure that we will have enough people to review it, and just to ensure that at least the content of the document reflects the working group consensus. But we will see that with Ben after this. I will go through. So the overload rate control is still. So for this one, what is missing is what is missing here is the write-up for this document, just to push it forward at the AG. Steve, please.
It has finished working group last call, though, right?
Already?
Rate has finished working group last call.
Yeah, for working group last call, yes. Just to be able to send it to the for ASG review. So my task. So the last one is the 406 that was in the working group last call, and yes, it's where it's. So this one was, we had one working group last call. We had some comments, but fairly. So it was only about some references and so on, but not a deep review of the technical content and so on. So it's something that I was waiting for some first input on the mailing list to be able to react. So I've sent it right before some comment, because it was not already pointed out by someone else. But I think that for this one, we will need further review. It could be through. I think that the working group last call process, anyhow, for DIME is not so relevant, but we can initiate a second one based on the new version, on the version 3, publish and capturing the comment received so far for the first working group last call. But we will need anyhow additional review, because, and especially from SA5 guys, so from the 3DPP, because they are the main users of this one. So I think the work done so far is good, but we will need just to ensure that what it is put here, and especially the new additional AVPs and so on, will fulfill the requirements. Any specific reaction on that? After that, we have the diameter AVP level security, so the end-to-end security for diameter. So for the time being, we have no draft anymore because the last one expired. Uni will not have so much time to work on, so I think I will not speak for him, but he would be happy to contribute on this one, but he's not able to support the workload alone. What we on Thursday, I will go to the SAG meeting, the security meeting, and I will ask for support from the security experts. So the idea will be to motivate people to work on this document. The solution itself doesn't have to be diameter specific, we can discuss with them if they have if there is something easy to do in this area for diameter that could be applicable to diameter. And based on the output, we will see what to do, and also after the discussion on the working group. Ben, please.
So Ben, I would personally like to see this completed, but I wanted to ask a question to this room. Is anyone in this room going to deploy it or implement it if it is completed?
Martin, please.
Martin Dolly. I mean, okay, so the next round of FCC CISRIC, they just finished the SS7 vulnerabilities, yada, yada. And the next 2 years is going to be looking at diameter. So what I plan on doing, SA3 is coming up in 3 weeks. And I'm bringing in a discussion paper, basically telling them of the status of this work here, and where, you know, it gets friendly talk at that meeting, you know, and actually has been brought up in the conversation of you know, 5G or overall securing the system. I'm going to let people to know it's now or never, forever hold your peace time. So.
Yeah. Another comment would be from the GSMA point of view. We have received an LS. So this one has been sent to 3GPP and Diameter just to be able to work on this solution, because GSMA, at least from a requirement point of view, would like to have a solution to recommend in their specification. So at least from a standard point of view, they are expecting a solution. After that, I think it will depend on the type of solution that would be adopted. If it is something that it is easy to implement, people will be, because we have ongoing deployment, ongoing operational networks for iPix. Yes, Eric, please.
This is Eric Gutman. For mission critical deployments, there's 2 security domains. One of them being the operator domain and one being the mission critical operator domain. And we've looked at securing the at a message, or even a I would say component to a SIP message level, securing these where the message has to be end-to-end secure between the client and the, let's say, the host and the mission critical service provider. I wonder if there are AAA requirements where you can't expose certain AVPs to the operator. I mean, that for the most part, the operations that we're using AAA for have to do with the access, but I'm wondering if there are AAA requirements that are emerging in mission critical. I think we should check that.
Actually, from the requirement point of view, both should be available with this solution. After that, it will depend on the type of solution that we will adopt, at least as a first step. But normally, you should be able to secure the signaling only between gateways, for instance, and you can assume that the different systems are secure enough to get rid of any security. But you may have also a real end-to-end security exchange between any Diameter clients and any Diameter server. Martin, please.
Okay, so I mean, not to have an SA3 discussion here, I don't think that is the case. I think that if you look at the European operators in particular, okay, so if you look at 401, 401 specifies that equipment manufacturers must support IPsec for communication within the EPC. It is optional to deploy, and I believe that optionality equals nobody has deployed. And so therefore, I know for 5G, one of the things that's being fought the most by the European operators is pulling the security further into the EPC and not at the B as an example, because they view their vulnerability to the fact that the EPC is open to the internet. And so some of those last couple statements aren't true, and what you're saying is true.
Okay. So at least, Ben, you know that there is some interest, and we will see. And actually, from a personal point of view, and Uni also, we would like to see this work done, and done within IETF. Yes, Ben.
This is Ben. I observe an interest in using the work. We will also need to observe an interest in doing the work.
Yes.
Which hopefully we'll get some help from SOG on that.
On this, I can comment this point. The key issue it was the same for Uni, is that it's more a security discussion than a diameter stuff. Personally, I could help on the diameter aspects and how to convey the information, defining the AVP, and even figure out how to behave. But on the security aspect itself, we need some expertise coming from the security area. Yes, Eric?
So just for my understanding, there was a mechanism, I know because I was largely to blame for it, for using an S-MIME encapsulation. That became historic at some point?
It was deprecated.
Okay.
It is said in the new version that this CMS mechanism is deprecated. And it is said also that a new mechanism will be defined, but outside the base protocol. And all the new drafts are based, and new RFC are based on these common things. End-to-end security is an issue, but we will have soon a solution. But the soon now is maybe 10 years. Not yet, but. I will skip the discussion on the other one, because we have, at least on the new proposal, and also the new version for policy group and predicted units, we have a specific one. I'm assuming that the one on domain arbitrary mask filters and peer flow mask big traits are just okay. So let's jump to the presentation. And you will start with predict unit and policy groups.
Yes, please.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. We're just going to run through kind of the updates for these two. So next slide, please. So predicted units, if you recall, our motivation was the fact that we're using NFV virtual functions, basically, and typically, right, we have authorization endpoints as a part of this inside our virtual network functions. What we're kind of starting to do is divorce the CPU, the compute, the memory, the disk, the IO resources as we virtualize away from the authorization. So we see a much bigger distance. It used to be we had fairly predictable hardware and sizes. Now everything kind of varies. And so what we're trying to do is basically send anytime an authorization occurs, basically a successful CCA to a CCR. We're trying to add some extra information, in this case, time of day matched to the amount of resources that may be utilized. Following the tradition of used service units and granted service units, we just call it predicted service units, with the full understanding that the units that we actually may send back may not relate to the actual grants. Grants may be, for example, in terms of bytes or time. However, predicted may actually be more granular based upon the system, something that's meaningful to the endpoint. So for instance, disk usage, network IO, some other metric. But we wanted to basically inform these virtual functions a little bit more about the usage that they can expect. This is especially important during peak times for the VNFs. So this then allows us to basically have the service, if you will, select if it needs a new scaling event, other things, you know, if you can think about NFV in the bigger picture, they can ask for scaling events, or they can just stop actually, you know, accessing or granting request into the system. So this allows us to avoid the situation that we're currently in today, which is I have to overload a virtual network function in order to realize I'm in trouble, or at least hit a threshold toward an overload before I realize I'm in trouble. So, and just for reference, it's still about 3 to 4 minutes to spin up a VNF virtual machine. So this sort of information is important to us. Anyway, so that's the base motivation with this, and it's essentially AVPs that are carried along during an authorization. Next slide. So in version 2, all of our updates were editorial. We were asked in the last meeting to really put that information in the introduction. And so we've rewritten that introduction. We're a bit more dictatorial about this. And then just as a refresher, right, this is essentially the same old in terms of units. The only difference is we have the time of day in there as far as an AVP to give you an idea of conditions. And then our assumption with the series is that there's non-overlapping times with respect to any particular unit. It's all in the spec, pretty straightforward. At this point, we've had a couple of updates before the last meeting. We had updates during the meeting. I have not received any new updates. So what I'd like to do is push for this being adopted either out on the mailing list, because we've had quorum issues in the past, but push for this to be adopted as a work group item on the mailing list after this meeting, if there's no other material updates here.
Okay, thank you. So for my information and for the group who has read this document, the predicted units. Okay, for them. So I wasn't there at the last meeting, but at least what was the feeling of the room, because it was not so clear.
I think there was some interest expressed. I think the larger discussion of the meeting was just the lack of the number of people.
Okay.
I think it focused more on that and the level of energy. So and I would argue that 2 of them were just waiting for a plane, but that's a whole other. Yeah.
Okay, so so I think it is straightforward, and I at least I understood the principle and also the proposed mechanism, so it's good. What we can do on this one would be to at least to check on the mailing list. So what we could do is to check on the mailing list if there is support and to ask for working group adoption. I think if it is the case, I think that there is not so much to do on this document that just to push it forward.
Yeah.
But it will depend also on the next discussion on what to do with the ongoing work and new works for the working group.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Understood. All right.
Further question or for clarification or comment? No, so I would propose to go on with the other one.
So policy groups, this is actually the harder of the 2. So the conceptually, what we're doing here is 2 things. So in the user plane, we're essentially adding metadata as another filter through the policy group matching mechanisms. And then what we're doing, at the higher level, if it's actually implemented before the user plane, we're essentially using this as a pre-screening mechanism to figure out what filter IDs apply. The good news is it's very consistent in terms of the back office, where, if you think of old service order codes or bit sets, we're really just flagging rules to policies and then using masking to figure out, when a particular product X or Y implement several rules, rather than mapping that as individual IDs. We're just running these as mask operations. This is, as we did our work and everything, what we found out was happening in our policy decision points anyway. And we also noticed, and we have some other updates, so I'll talk about here in a second in terms of examples of where we found this actually being applied, particularly in OpenFlow switches in the metadata fields. So we also wanted to pick up some of the common naming that we kind of enjoy over in 3GPP as well for grouping. So this is all about efficiency. For those who are familiar with 3GPP charging characteristics, it's there. It's just a little bit more generalized. Next slide. So this is once again an editorial update. We didn't change anything structurally. What we did was we reworked the examples based upon the feedback, once again, from the last meeting. So next slide. So as a reminder, this is the relationship model. And here we talk about policy entities being kind of your rules and having this bit mask assignment and then the group mapping type. Users have memberships to multiple rules, either through the domain, which is very similar to a base name, as well as the bit mask value. So this is your base relationship model. And that was added prior to the last meeting. So before that, it was all text and definitely not a fun spec to read. So next slide. So we have a couple of examples that we've added, but this is more the visual. So one of the issues we encountered was over on the left side. So in SDN switches, we're typically limited in terms of the number of tables. So when we talk about SDN switches serving a large number of customers, one of the typical issues we run into is the default rule. So the match for any traffic and then applying different treatments. In the typical world, if we just stick to the traffic headers themselves, these rules overlap and we need multiple tables. What we did by adding essentially the metadata information, basically the match type and the membership values in here, is we've added them in this example to table 0 on the right. And so what you see is essentially, and we're just dividing this up by subnets, but what we're essentially doing is where table 1 would actually figure out what subnet you belong to, then apply your subnet specific policy. We're able to, with this metadata value, essentially to concatenate that into a single table. So you see if we're in subnet 1, we set the membership values initially. So we're just setting up basically the bit mask involved. And in the next table, we're actually concatenating. So you'll notice that these rules no longer overlap. In table 1 on the right, we do have essentially the any traffic descriptors on table 1 on the right, and we're actually now relying on the match type and membership value to really drive essentially the base. So in table 0, you set that membership value of the user here. You then match against it in table 1 over here. This allows us to go to a 2-table solution. And like I said, effectively, we're just extending the filter. And really what it boils down to is, especially in SDN switches, we have the metadata field. We're really just clarifying how you would actually use your metadata field and tie it back to a customer. And so this allows us then to kind of reduce the number of tables. So this is just one example. So next slide, please. This is a much simpler example. If you're not doing this in the decision point, you can actually apply this type of logic up front, or excuse me, in the enforcement point. You can apply this decision up front at the decision points. Determine that at runtime, also cross-reference it with your time of day if your enforcement point doesn't actually enforce time of day, and then send down the active rules for the enforcement point. So this is a very simple example, but what's important about this is it's using the exact same fields. It's just basically pre-executing, if you will, that metadata match. And this really just boils down to the fact that we do not change a user's relationship with their products or services typically during the session. When we do that, we typically do a reauthorization as an operator. So this allows us in certain decision points to execute here. So we've got one example where we show it basically expanding the filters in the enforcement point. We've got the second example where we're essentially in what I'll call a much simpler enforcement point, enforcing it at the decision point and then sending it down. So those are your two easy applications, and you can imagine combinations thereof and all sorts of optimizations taking place if there's multiple levels of hierarchy. But we just wanted to keep it to a couple of examples here rather than spending a long time writing a dissertation in an RFC. Next slide. So we've talked a little bit about applications. Today we actually do use this. So as an operator, and I'll give one real world example, and I'm quite sure you can guess which operator it is. With about 60 million devices, there were 1,200 rules, or at least what was thought to be distinct rules. Upon further analysis, 1,200 rules in OpenFlow across 60 million devices is a little bit daunting and just not going to work. At the end of the day, it just isn't happening. So we ended up using the metadata as we described, along with the binary masking. So we have, we're a mobility side in this implementation, 3-table downlink design. Once again, where we match the destination IP, set the metadata in the OpenFlow, if you're familiar with that, and then carried that over, had the original rule plus the extra metadata to do the deduplication, and then execute it. We've done a similar design in the uplink. This just kind of gives you the idea, values in terms of how we approached it. And you can talk to me later offline if you have more questions about it. A similar design in the uplink. Basically, the 1,200 rules, once we were deduplicated, became about 200. And then we found some other optimizations as well. And I hate to say it, but really, we like to think we do lots of things. Arguably, we really only have 12 actions. So there's only 12 to 16 rules that really make up that particular, what we thought was 30, 40 distinct products. So this is where, as marketing, you think you're this big. As network designers, you think you're this big. As engineers, you think you're this big. And then upon further review, you're doing like maybe 12 or 16 distinct activities. So we've been able to use this technique and apply it in our systems today on SDN switches and reap the benefits. So it kind of gives you an idea of where this is. I think next slide. So next steps, this is not a fun document. It's not an easy one. So I'd appreciate more reviews. I know we had some good feedback in the last meeting before we actually even bother with any sort of last call. I'd like to hear more from the group.
So,
Excuse me, adoption. Why am I thinking?
So question for the floor. So who has read the document? Oh, we have 2, 3. And so first of all, any question for clarification or comments? At least I have one. It's so you said that you may. So when you said adopted in this proposal, saying that the use of base name is was introduced in 3GPP, or
so we picked membership domain.
Okay.
Not to confuse, right? So base name right is more of an organizational concept of rules, and here we're trying to pull that up in sort of the metadata abstraction because we did not want to confuse people who were already actively using base name as a convenience mechanism. But we wanted a similar aggregation concept and still maintain backwards compatibility. So we don't want to be coy and say it's something completely different. We want to keep it separate enough so that, because we do use baseNAM as an operator, so we wanted it to basically point out it's similar, and for backwards compatibility purposes, it would be a separate AVP. So we also gave it a different name. Since we're talking about sets and membership, we just refer to it as a membership domain.
Okay.
So yes.
What about I think that, as you said, I've read the document, but I think we need I would need also another review to be able to understand, because actually I understood exactly the mechanism arriving at the end of the document, especially when the AVP is defined. I think it would be useful to have more review, and we will see what to do with this one again after that.
Yeah, I would. My ideal situation, I'm still not happy with the examples. I would like them to be straightforward all the way through the documents in transition. But trying to describe that and set logic and everything, you know, as a single author, it's a bit tough.
Yeah, I think that one other point also would be to so maybe it is there, but to clearly identify why it is not so easy to do it with existing mechanism today.
Yes.
Based on what we have within IETF or even within 3GPP.
Yeah, and I think quite simply, and we distinctly say it in just a few sentences, but basically all of our filters today are based on time and what's in the packets. And unfortunately, when the time's the same and the rule is particularly like a default rule, unfortunately, that's the most common overlap we have in the system.
But
so that's just one example, but that's usually where we run into.
But actually, this is something that you can understand easily when you see the definition of the AVP. But in the rationale for the creation of this AVP, it was not so clear. You said that there is some overlapping, but I think it would be easier to describe it.
Understood. Yep.
At least it would be my feedback.
Yep. All right. Thank you.
So let's go for the new proposed work item, that is specification recommendation. So you have about 15 minutes, so you can use them.
Good. I can ignore most of the errors then. This will be great. Thank you. So next slide. So, you know, and I apologize, but I wanted to be a little bit operator specific. So we're doing a few projects here, and actually I'd sent you, there's an update, but we're doing a few projects here in implementation in open source, and we just basically noticed that over the wire, everything was great, but getting to consistency compatibility above the wire line was a real pain. And so I am fortunate enough that I get to torture my developers because I also get to do research on them. So what we did was we tracked under 2 repos what was coded each night and what was coded each release, and I was able then to track back what was happening when an error occurred or a test incompatibility occurred. And what we found was 85% of the time, an inconsistency above the over-the-wire occurred due to an error or a lack of inconsistency or some ambiguity in the text of the spec that it was associated with, or and the developer, I would say, filling in the blanks rather than coming to us and asking the experts what the question was. They would fill in the blanks. So this is more about people being very nervous and trying to get code done than it is about a spec being right or wrong. So that started a campaign. We essentially thought as a litmus test to prove the developers wrong, we should be able to go from spec to code very quickly and do most of it. Not to automate the developers, but to really validate that specs can be A, validated, and B, our litmus test would be automatic code generation. So, next slide. We were terribly wrong in our hypothesis that we could do this consistently, quickly, and efficiently, or in some cases at all. We ran into over 970 different errors looking at 30 different specifications. We categorized them in large swaths. Excuse me. And this is just the highlight. So even in the document, just so you know, I don't list all 973 errors. I only, for your pleasure, only go through broad swaths of categories. So please keep in mind, it's not an exhaustive list in the document. But we wanted to get this out to the group. So in this task of going from spec to code, the first thing we found was too many table formats. We couldn't argue that it was a change over time because some of the specs that we looked at started and ended at the same time. So it was just inconsistent table formats for things like defined and imported AVPs. Imported AVPs were actually very tough. Some specs reused AVPs but didn't have import tables. So we would try to actually build and compile a spec and then realize we didn't actually have the right AVP loaded, or the spec was wrong, or the number was wrong, or the version was wrong. So that slowed us down. There were some outright errors, particularly in 3GPP and billing. In release 14, a good example is a lot of the AVPs driven by extra services from release 12 to release 13 are mentioned in 32.299 and even in 298, right, in terms of the over-wire format, but they do not appear anywhere in any other document. They're around typically machine type communication. PROSI has a lot of AVPs defined. In fact, there's an entire swath of AVPs where we found that there was an attempt to add to the 3GPP registry, and then it looked like the CR never made it through. And so when you actually go look in for the AVP codes, they're missing, almost 64 AVPs. So there's errors. And we've gone back and looked through the documents as a group. So it's a bit challenging to get implementations, and we've documented as much of that as we can. But these are all typically, we found actually just machine errors, right? Someone's actually tried to do something, or there's a lot of document references and we chase documents. But this is pretty typical across the specs. Now keep in mind, we're looking at a lot of specs as well. So didn't know, I can pause anytime for questions. So
it would be wonderful if you could send some of these errors to SA5 charging, or even if you don't have a delegate there.
We don't. So, but the other side was, as a stream of consciousness, we decided to put them in here because we also wanted to, right? We at least want to get them out somewhere. And I apologize, my particular group does not, but we wanted to get that out in the open. So a lot of this is also the fact that if we talk about programmatic verification, there's some things you just can't get from a spec. So an app ID, it's there, but try to find a consistent way to find the app IDs that are in there. Try to find, so you start tying all this data together in the name of this, right? Textually, as a human, you can read it, but when you sit down and say, how would I write code to actually parse a document, validate it like we do with NITs, and verify that it's good, things start, things start missing in the documents. The next slide. So our methodology, basically we create we split, not because we need to, but because we're experimenting here. We pull out the AVP define tables, the imports tables. We pull out metadata based upon the app IDs. And then we convert the document to text. We actually have some Python that converts it into the dia fuzzer format that automatically generates it. And then just as a secondary validation, we have exporters that export that to free diameter library code to verify that we actually can compile something and we might have an idea of what we're doing. And this forced us into individually tackling the problems a lot. And it also forced us to really do things that we wouldn't normally, as a human, we don't care about, but when we start running a compiler, we totally do. So this really forces items. We did, in several cases, have to add enums as a appended file. And I won't even begin to discuss, you've seen in the document, we recommend not using enums. That's how bad it got for us. And there's lots of inconsistency there. So this is kind of the base design for that. Next slide. So we did have some unexpected use cases in terms of AVPs that further refined an existing group or command. So because we didn't have the linkage back to the original AVPs, this is actually really hard in terms of setting up the library in the code and populating the libraries at the code level. And so without that information, what we found was we generated some really nice code that was completely useless. Because what would happen is it would redefine the AVP in the library, and basically, rather than saying I extend the AVP, which many libraries support, it would actually attempt to redefine the AVP in the code and get a conflict. So for the API software, that was incredibly important, although it's easy to detect. Because if we look at the AVPs that are imported, we can realize it's defined and imported. It's a very simple situation. We got a lot of inconsistencies where in this situation, because it's defined and imported, sometimes it showed up as an import, sometimes it showed up as a define, and sometimes there was no mention of anything. Which then left us in the software with some things to deal with. And there's no concept, right, of imported commands. So don't even forget about, just forget about it. So next slide. So, I hate to say it, I'm an editor of 4006, so I was not immune to this. We found a couple of errors, a typo. So this is not me going around and trying to be, I'm actually, I thought I had a good spec. I'm just happy I found like only 2 out of the whole thing. So, and we'll correct those, by the way, with the cumulative update. Our plan is to correct those 2 items because they are editorial, as well as the update on the reference in 4006 in the next revision. So, next slide. The first line just says it all. Over the wire diameter is fine. Trying to programmatically pull out enumerations, if you want a root canal, every time you do it out of the spec, you go for it. Part of it boils down to, right, we don't specify the label formats, we don't specify the orders, and it shows. Even in some documents, we would have, and it showed the age. The longer the document, the more revisions. So typically, this doesn't happen in RFCs. Because, right, we're kind of a one-shot, but in multi-revision documents, we would see 3 or 4 different formats for enumerations in the same document. So the longer lived your application, the higher probability you got wild inconsistencies with enumerations. We also see characters that are invalid in any language. There are some labels that have slashes in them, but one value. So there's no hope of generating any code, let alone parsing. So we did see some crazy things, just plain old references to web pages with like some anchors that kind of got you close, typically referencing OMA enumerations. We did see reference to registries, which we would expect. Now they weren't actually enum registries, they were different protocol registries and other items. And we did see reuse of enums, which was interesting, where they would either extend or say, we reuse this enum, but not that one value, which I'm not even sure how we would go about enforcing that in a library. So Just generally, what I've got my group doing is trying to avoid enums at all costs at this point. So next slide. Recommendations. This is really simple. Just go for consistency in spelling and case, and you'll go a long way. Just get rid of the spaces between all your dashes. That happens a lot more than you think. That also helps. We need to decide whether or not we're truly, because the thing is, diameter over the wire is fine, but we need to probably decide, are we really case sensitive when it comes to these IDs for the names? Or my favorite one is, could we please get consistent naming on the command label versus the command acronym versus the actual command definition? I would urge you to look at reauthorization request and the number of ways it's actually specified. There's a running bet on my team as to the number of new ways every time we load in a spec that reauth will be extended one more time. By the way, so far the answer is 15 different ways to specify reauthorization request in text. So far, so good. Anyway, there's a lot of things that we do this. Don't try to use underscores unless it's part of labels, right? I won't go into the details, but it makes life interesting for software in general and constants. But it's kind of this. Next slide. We do have some other recommendations in terms of tables. This just kind of gives you the basics. It's a lot of what we're doing in the latest specs, but it's just to point out kind of formats. So next slide kind of shows you a couple example formats that seem to work really well.
You have less than 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So this kind of shows you some things that work out pretty well in terms of formats that are easy to parse. If you're wondering, there are over 19 known regular expressions in our software to actually just do tables for defined tables. We reduced that from 28. So we actually cheat and reformat. We drop columns. We think we can reduce that to 12. We'd like to actually just reduce it to 2 going forward. So we understand backwards compatibility, but this is a lot of work if we talk about programmatic verification. Next slide. Imported AVPs, if you import them, please note it. Just please do it. I won't go into a long diatribe, but it's really inconsistent. With the full understanding, when you're refining it, it's a little murky, right? That's an open question, what you should do. When you're actually running this, right, probably adding whether or not you're changing the M-bit semantics, which, by the way, per the guideline definitions has other rules that kick in, but at least noting that there in the table so we understand that we should be doing some compliance checks, which has also caused us some errors, will help us out. Next slide. Grouped AVPs and really commands, the refinement, we've talked a little bit about that. A couple things we want to note. So we do assume a precondition of star of actually inclusion. By the way, there's a couple violations of that where there is a refinement. And I will fully admit we accidentally attempted to do that in 4006 until it was noted. So it does happen. Semantic rules for refinement, right? Stay within the range of the original, right? If you're further refining the range, just stay within XY. We did add a new item to our metadata into the header format. We added refines and then the app ID refining into the CCF in our intermediate format. And that, by the way, took care of this issue for 99% of our, or actually all of our use cases. So this just lets us know it's a refinement, which then allows us then to properly generate code. So once again, it doesn't hurt diameter over the wire, but it does help in code generation as well as the engineer understanding that it appears in this app. It will also appear in a different app ID. That's okay. That was intentional. Furthermore, it was changed in the new app. Now, arguably, we thought at one point that we only refined the original app ID. We were completely proven wrong with TS99-061. I would urge you, if you want to look at an extreme example of refinement use cases and some very interesting AVPs, that's probably the one that took us the longest, over a couple days of just trying to figure out what was going on there and bringing it in. But it's definitely, I would call it the extreme example of what you can do with diameter. Also, to me, at least academically, the most interesting. But by adding this, we were actually in pretty good shape. Now, one of the more open questions is, if you could do something like limit the range and say there's only 5 AVPs added versus the star, that's an interesting question from a programmatic point of view, computer science point of view. I don't know from a practical point of view I'd ever want to say you can have up to 5 other AVPs inside this, but it's definitely an interesting thought. Is that extensible? Would we ever allow that? Is that something? And actually, I don't know. Is that something that's permitted? Could I have a star 5 and then AVP?
Yeah.
I have no idea how I'd even enforce that, but that's a whole other.
It's something that you can define when you can decide when defining the group AVP. So,
okay, well, please don't do that. That would be, yeah. So I guess it's possible, but I would be afraid. That would be a lot of semantic checking. So next slide. So this is an example of how we're applying refines. So when we do not supply the app ID, we look for the original definition where no refined statement exists. That requires a search. We could actually probably be more specific and add another keyword called defining or defines, which actually just says this is the definitive root for this code. But that once again helps out with this. So this is a practical example from 29.128 in terms of refinement. So, and the rules are in there. So next slide.
I would propose to jump into the conclusion because
yeah, absolutely. So
I think we get
we've got there's a lot of little stuff in here. There's some great open questions like this. Do we go back and fix the things we've identified? That's a more working item question and more about the future of the work group. I also don't want to go back and fix things that we're really not carrying forward. So I would argue it's at the very least, if we commit to it, it's a case-by-case basis based upon where the errata applies. And I'm more than happy to go back and file where I need to the errors. But we wanted to get it out and get it discussed more than anything else. We have a class of UINT32s that we've seen called pseudo enumerations where it looks like in the spec they're trying to avoid enums altogether. And do we want to support that as a use case? That seems to be kind of the current trend in some of the later specs that are fairly useful. And then what do we want to do on define and refine it? So those are kind of the open questions. So next slide. So summary here is diameter over the wire is fine. This is evidenced by the fact that we all interoperate together. But going from spec to validation or spec to code, that's an entirely different story. And so there's an opportunity for doing better. We can add a few things into the formats, entirely optional, and we can even implement some of the other formats. These are all minor items. They don't affect anything over the wire. But if we decide to maybe do this as like a style convention as opposed to something that's normative, we can talk about a tool, whether it's at 3GPP or whether it's part of I wouldn't make it a part of the NITS process, right, where you kind of get rejected. But maybe a validation tool. I know Benoit is in the back, has a lot of Yang validation and stuff that also does this. So we know it can be done. We know it can work through a process, but it would be nice, I think as an author, regardless of where I'm working, to be able to validate. So as far as the document, like I said, we wanted to get this out. What we do with it is there, and I think the other recommendation is enums. Enums are a pain in the rear. And I would argue, I know Uni talked about it the last meeting, but enums are much worse than I anticipated. I know he knew this. I am feeling the pain now as managing a team of 10 people doing development related to diameter. And I would urge, regardless of where it's done, we should probably think about tackling enumerations in terms of formats and getting it better. And I'd like to see some of the other use cases picked up as well. So, any questions?
Any question or comments? Who has read the documents? 3. Maybe Martin is out.
And I know Uni and Dave Dolson, who could not be here, have also looked at the document as well, although it was much rougher form.
So, from a practical point of view, I think that you as the author, I think that a lot of stuff So I think that there is two types of mistakes. First of all, would be about the documentation issue. It's more about how it is, for instance, in the 3GPP spec. For instance, when you say refined, it's not totally refined. It's because in 3GPP specification, they just highlight the AVPs that they are using.
Yes.
They are doing the same for the commands. And but you're right. When you have coding people just taking the specification and just not reading anything, but just
just looking. Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Because from their point of view, they just want to get to the actual grammar, write the code, and then be done.
Exactly.
And then they're surprised when it doesn't work, because and they'll always tell me, I followed the document.
Yeah, I know. So I think that at least so for this one, I think it should be taken into account when actually drafting a new specification and so on. For the existing one, I think it would be actually difficult because it's just a documentation issue. But where there is some things to clarify, I think that it can be done either by an errata within IETF, because when you said it will not fix, normally people using the RFC documents need to go through the errata to discover that something is wrong in the existing spec. And it could be through CRs to a 3GPP spec, but we can see what to do after that.
Okay. So question then for you or for the group, right? This has a lot of errors in it. And I once again wanted to get the information out. Would this be more appropriate as something informational of which to drive requirements or recommendations, kind of like the app guidelines as a style guide? Because I don't want it to be normative and prescriptive, but how would this document logically progress?
I think that this kind of document could be, so from my point of view, and depending on what we would do after that, but it could be just for information, because if you have done the work, it could be at least useful information for the community. And it could be also even referenced by other things, that there is no guideline here, just to highlight what could be wrong or what could cause some issues if you are not taking care of this type of stuff, for instance, and then the way to describe the labels and so on. Yeah,
so I would probably then, based upon that, change the style. So right now it's more of just a stream of conscience. It's actually an error list, I can tell you, from a large repository, but turning it more into a little bit more of a report style.
But actually, it would not be. It could be good, but it would not be the first time that we have this type of document within IETF, because it could be some. We have some documents just explaining all the issues that we had for implementing such protocol without any rationale and so on, just to explain where we had some issues. And but you will decide. How to do that.
Okay.
I will propose to jump to. So thank you, Lion. I will skip the milestone just to highlight the fact that there is nothing new on this one, and I will just open the floor for discussion about the future of the working group. So we have 3 remaining active documents from working group documents. The other one are either already RFCs or at the EHG level, or almost. Sorry? Yes. So we have few people in the room, not so much activity on the mailing list, and we have an additional issue, is that I will not be able to go on my chairmanship in DIME working group. There is too much work with those guys in 3GPP now. But honestly, with the 5G stuff, we have a lot of coordination internally and across the companies, and also we need to set up conf call and so on. So at least I will not be available as I was in the past. And we have the same issue with Uni. So he moved from a company to another company, so he will not be able to go on too much on this one. So we have a clear issue here about the future of the working group. So what should be the next step except closing the group, and what, if it is the case, what to do with the existing documents? Yes?
So if I remember, this is Ben, if I remember correctly, the existing documents were all either post or near working group last call, right?
Yes.
So it is conceivable that those could be, in the hands of the, at least to IETF last call, or in the hands of the area directors before long. What's your time frame for needing to step down as chair?
I think that personally, my main concern would be to know exactly when to stop adopting new documents, just to ensure that if we have a timeline or at least a work plan to say we need to conclude all this work and after that it's done, I think even for UNI it will be achievable, because we are in the same in the same situation.
So the two drafts that are candidates for adoption, I'm trying to remember what they were.
The predicted unit and
I think the predictive units one would be quite reasonable, as AD sponsored.
Straightforward, yes.
The group one is kind of on the border from my perspective, because that kind of hits a little deeper into the where you use the protocol. But that's not out of the question, right? That we could consider that as well. I think I would need to think more closely about that for me to do it. I also don't have to be the AD sponsor, right? But assuming it's me, I would want to look a little more closely.
At least for the group one, I think we will need the additional review and to see if there is interest in at least some people to be willing to work on.
Right, and even if we AD sponsor things, I like to have people review them.
Obviously. But actually, even Lang said that he will need not only to review them, but to comment and to contribute to this one if there is something to modify, even in the shape of the document. So for sure, we need someone to work on. And as I said, the end-to-end security, from my point of view, need to be done. So we will see after the Thursday meeting with SAG if we have people volunteering to work on.
So I would, for that I would say let's see what happens in SAG. If we actually see some realistic interest, maybe that's something we spin up a little mini work group for. Maybe that's, I don't know if that's something we'd AD sponsor or not. I want to talk to the security ADs, and I think Benoit is here. Maybe Ops AD. Or the other possibility would be to, and this is just speculating, recharter DIME with new chairs, to just do that, which is kind of the same thing as spinning up a new mini work group.
I think that if it is only, I would say only, it will be at least something that we will need to do anyhow. But if it is only to go on with the existing one, even with the new adopted, at least one or two, I think it is achievable in a short time frame. I will need to confirm with Uni, but at least we will need to share the work, and we will need also volunteers, because it's not only about the chairs, it's also about people reviewing that.
Right.
Defining a new charter with a new chair, I think only for that will not be useful. And
this feels like something that might ought to happen in the security area to me, just to get the interest going there. But we would have to talk with the security ADs.
Yes, I will have a talk also with Kathleen before the SAG meeting. So, can I summarize that at least at this stage? So, and obviously, if there is something to do and there is interest and so on, it will not preclude to reopen a new group based on this one or in a new context. But to summarize the discussion, is there any other comment on this one? So, the existing document, the existing working group document will be pushed forward. At least for the predicted units, we can. It will be confirmed on the mailing list, but we can assume that this one will become a working group document. And for the group one, we will check. And after those documents, we will close the working group. Yes. Yeah, it will be. We will confirm it on the mailing list. But I think that for the predicted units, I think that for this one, it would be there is interest and it should be straightforward. So there is no reason to not adopting it. But what was your point, Ben? To have it as.
So this is Ben again. My point was that if those two drafts, predictive definitely, and maybe group, could be candidates for just AD sponsorship.
Oh.
So
It's fine.
if we want to go ahead and check on group interest and adopt them, they can still change to AD sponsorship if we decide to shut the group down.
Okay.
It's just, let's keep in mind that I'm very skeptical about bringing new work into the group right now unless we see some
Okay, so
renewed interest.
the last two remaining, so the individual drafts will be candidate for AD sponsoring.
Yeah, and I think the first one is a good candidate for that. The second one I need to look at more closely and think about.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you for being there. And so I received the feedback that I was looking for. So thanks for that. And so see you in, I don't know when exactly, but actually during the week for a drink. Thank you. It was DIME. A little bit.